and welcome to a very special episode of Beyond Brands with Belle Baldoza.
Oh, thank you so much, Kudra. Thank you for having me here.
Of course.
And yeah, really glad to be here and excited to speak with you.
We're super excited. Thank you for coming here, especially with the weather warning out there. It's been a doozy, but I really appreciate it.
Oh, happy to be here.
So, for our guest, has had a very prolific career and continues to do so. She has worked with every potential tech unicorn that you've ever been envious about. Say Airbnb, Spotify, Netflix, Uber, and now works with TikTok as the global brand communications. And it's a very exciting time for us. So, Belle, why don't you start off with something that all of us are really intrigued with? You've worked with every tech giant in the world, but little known fact, Belle worked with them in the really early stages as well. So I'm very curious how the culture and the DNA was back then and what you still see now.
Oh, that's a really great question to start with. And yeah, I guess like I haven't really worked with exactly every tech unicorn, but like I've had the privilege of being able to work with some of the world's most disruptive and interesting companies out there, especially in their very early days. I was part of the pioneer communications teams at Spotify and at Netflix, and also at TikTok when it just like merged with Musically in 2018. In the very early days, there was really like, I would say like a lot of focus on like growth, and with that, like being in communications, it was such a great, it's still such a great time to be in communications, doing communications for these companies right now. But I think even more so in the very early days when PR was such an instrumental, it was instrumental in building the brand from scratch. And so being a part of the pioneering teams, there was a lot of like scrappiness and resourcefulness and resilience that needed to come with a job, and that was like definitely something that I really enjoy, and I feel has still, throughout all these years, that spirit of doing a lot of things with like little resources, or trying new ways, like new and creative ways to tell a story, that still rings true, like even though like like some of these teams have already grown significantly from the very early days.
Interesting. That's really interesting to see because one thing that I did see in another podcast of yours that you had put out there is that you launched a lot of these brands in different markets. So while scrappiness and innovation and utilizing little resources is something that was similar through across these tech unicorns, how did they differ? Like, was there any playbook for the global storytelling? And also, I wanted to ask a bit of a nuanced question here. They have their authentic brand identity, but when you go into a global market, there's also you have to adapt locally. So, how do you go about figuring out that tension? And yeah, if you could just share some light on that.
Yeah, absolutely. Like I think that you asked a very nuanced, multi-level question. So like let me try to go at it one by one. What's really interesting, I think, like about the roles that I've had the privilege of having is that there's actually like no playbook. I'm always like almost always the first one in that role,
Wow.
or in that team. Like I'm like one of the first people, like first 10 in a team. And so with that, there's really like no global playbook. So basically what you're doing is like you're you're constantly building the plane as you fly it, and with that like you're developing the playbook. And so like with that, like you really like will need to learn how to improvise and think on your feet, and also really have that agility, and like just like have maintain a fast pace of working.
Okay.
And so like I think like that's really important. So there was no playbook. We built the playbook. And I think like your question about like global versus local, I've basically like held roles in a market capacity, in a regional capacity when I was heading up communications for Asia Pacific. And now like in a global capacity where I work with our communications leads from all over the world and across all the regions like where we operate. And what I have truly learned about balancing global versus local is that as a brand, it is important to maintain a distinct identity by making sure that your brand framework is global by design but local by execution. So
Okay.
that means that there is that consistency of how the brand appears. There's that consistency of how the brand sounds like,
Okay.
but then at the same time provide your market teams the flexibility of how does then that brand come alive in like very very different markets, or from Sao Paulo to Singapore. You can still feel that yes, this is a brand that we know, but then also that this is a brand that we can relate to. The like relevance is important, and making sure that like your brand feels local.
Very interesting. So, what I'm hearing is that, okay, if I see this brand and I want to buy into the aspiration, it might be same in India or Canada or Brazil, but you're saying in execution, how that message is delivered varies a lot.
100%,
Okay.
100%. And like we've actually like done that approach, like I would say like from my work with Spotify, where it is like at Spotify, like we've had the great opportunity of actually doing our launches with a PR led approach.
Okay.
So PR really helps lead with like driving that storytelling around what Spotify is, and like what's the platform's role in like shaping the future of music and audio. And my strategy, like at the time when I was like leading our go-to market launches for Spotify, was to actually like really draw into people's relationship with music in that market. And that really came very useful to me, like when we were launching in the Philippines, which is like my home country, where music is really, I would say, part of the psyche of the people.
The best singers are in Philippines. I believe
It
that.
is a stereotype, but like
But I
would
love
say,
it.
I would say it is somewhat true. I feel like the karaoke game of Filipinos are strong. So what I, like at that time, like I really like looked into like deep into like myself, like how would Filipinos like kind of relate to Spotify? Like how could a brand, a global brand like Spotify, speak to them in a language that would like help introduce the brand into like the local consciousness?
And that's a really tough act to follow, because I'm guessing Philippines has a very defined set of what music means to them, how they consume it, and for this new player to come in and say, "Hey, just switch to us," that would have been one of the probably challenging PR campaigns. Or can you think of something that's more specific to just Philippines? Because I'm super intrigued by this.
Yeah, well, I think that like a lot of the times, like that's something that, like going back to the Philippines example, like with music for Spotify, I think that like the PR story there, which just wasn't like, okay, like we're using like language about, say, like local language to say hello, and like all the marketing collaterals would look like that, but it was also how the product felt. Like, so I worked with our like editorial team, and they consulted me about the playlists, and a lot of like the playlists like would be more around like local music and like local use cases.
Got it.
Because we have this saying in Philippines, it's called hugot, just like coming in from the heart.
Oh,
It's like
love
something that comes in from your heart. And I actually like was working with like one of our editors, I remember, and like he was curating a playlist of romantic songs, and I said like we should actually like name this hugot.
Oh.
And I think it's still there. I think like it's still like one of the popular local playlists in the
Wow, I
Philippines.
love that you share that, because that really gives the essence of what it was to kind of build out this campaign there. I like that you started with this, because I feel like a few of our audience might not be aware between the distinction between PR, publicity, and other marketing tools. So, could you just explain, when you said that Spotify had a PR led approach, what does that mean as opposed to other approaches?
Yeah, I think like that's the thing that probably was like a little different, because like you have to also put into consideration, I'm probably like dating myself, like this is probably over a decade ago. So I would say that like we've really like made strides into, I would say, like coupling PR and marketing into like a holistic storytelling effort, or a holistic brand building effort at this time. But during that time, like the way that I would look at it was like what I always would say was PR was something that you pray for, and marketing was something you pay for.
I love that.
And when you pay for something, you pay for an ad, you pay for a sponsorship. These are placements, right? That like you strategically place so that like your brand is going to be visible. When you have a PR led approach to something, you basically have to lead with a news agenda. What is going to capture the ears of a journalist? Like, what's going to be the headline about your product? Because you don't have those resources, you let the journalists you basically influence the journalists to write something positive about your product in the hopes of then the people who are following the journalists like then are positively influenced and get to know your brand. So that's what I mean by a PR-led approach.
I love that distinction. I feel like anyone asks me what's PR, I'm going to be like, that's what you pray for.
You do
Not
pray
pay
for
for.
that. You do pray for that because in PR there are no guarantees.
There are no guarantees. That's true. That's interesting to me. We've discussed this aspect about companies, but I also want to switch back and forth between your own personal career and your journey. So we're talking about how brands kind of leverage PR to come into new markets. You've successfully switched to so many companies and countries actually, and regions. That's actually true. There was a Freudian slip, but it's true. What parallels can you draw, if there are any, between how you go about storytelling for a brand as opposed to how you position yourself? Are there any similarities? Would you even want to draw that parallel? How do you see building your own reputation, your own set of ideals to pray for, not pay for? How does that work? Are there any parallels there?
Oh, I love that. I love that question. Probably I'll start with walking through my storytelling framework for how I see, how I see a story become successful, or what makes a story successful for a product or a brand. And I think there's a couple there's really a few things there. It's really I look at it as a trifecta of things that come together. So think about it as a Venn diagram. There's the product truth and what's really true operationally about your product. How does it work? Okay. Right? And then there's what's true about your brand in terms of what you want it to stand for. Do you want it to stand for, I don't know, the leading platform in its industry, or a platform that brings joy, or a platform that connects community? And then you bridge that then with what is true about people. You bridge that with human truth. And this is how people relate this is how people are being entertained. This is how people are discovering new content. And I think that bridging those three and finding a sweet angle that goes into that makes for a really successful brand story.
Okay.
Product truth, brand truth, human truth.
Got it.
What I personally operate in, because of the product and brand truth, I think from a personal perspective comes together, because I don't necessarily think I'm not interested in commodifying myself.
Yeah.
But at the same time, I do want to share things that I think would be helpful for, especially for aspiring communications professionals to learn. And so I basically try to appeal to what's true and what people are thinking. And the next one is around my brand, and my brand is really more around creative brand storytelling. And so I try to bridge those two together in terms of what is true about people, and people want to know, for example, how did you get there? What was your career path? And then I bridge it back to what does Belle stand for, or what does Belle want to be known as or remembered as?
I love that. I think I read somewhere about you that you interviewed for, correct me if I'm wrong, but this was Spotify, and then you went and met them at a cafe, and you came out and you said, you need to know two things. I'm not a tech person, and there was another thing, I don't speak Mandarin.
Yes.
Is that right?
Yes.
And
yes.
I just love that, because I was just you build something on absolute radical transparency, which people keep throwing out there, but people don't really know what it means. And I thought that was a really great example of radical transparency. I wanted to understand from you, are there mentors and other people that you've worked with in spaces that have exhibited that radical transparency? And I feel that's something that is very misunderstood, but very, very important, especially if a brand needs to be authentic. So does some company or some brand that kind of embody that? Does that come to light for you?
I would say like transparency in all like different shapes and forms like is important. The degree of radicalness might vary,
Yeah.
but it is important for a brand to be true to itself, to be true. There's an aspiration for brands to become something, but then a brand also needs to know what it really can and can't do for people.
Yeah. Yeah.
So there always has to be that like self-awareness. If a brand was going to be a person, there has to have that, like it has to have that degree of self-awareness. And I think like going back to your point around like transparency, like I think like I've seen that like it play out in different forms really. And the different platforms that I work for, you know, like transparency is definitely something that is important, especially for a platform like Spotify, in terms of like how it pays artists, like, and at TikTok, for example, transparency is important in terms of like making sure that like people understand our ongoing commitment to actually like fight harmful content or content that doesn't actually follow the guidelines. And so I think transparency to that extent is important, to that degree, and like there definitely is a lot of, I would say, like there are a lot of initiatives that really focus on that. I think, you know, like I'm a big fan of like Radical Candor by Kim Scott, and that philosophy of making sure that like, you know, you actually care for someone by providing them with like feedback that is actionable. But at the same time, it is like, it's not feedback that's like a feedback sandwich that you're just trying to like, you know, you're just trying to hide
Close
it
the loop.
between, yeah, you're just trying to like hide it between two things. And I think like those are like the things that I stand for, as an individual, but like those are also like the things that like I share, like, you know, in any forum that like I am a part of. Yeah.
I love that. Going back to more technical questions that I had, we cannot have any podcast without talking about AI. The
Oh my God,
buzzword.
it is the favorite. It is the buzzword.
It is a
of
buzzword,
the
but
season.
but rightly so. There's no industry shift has happened as much as with AI. I want to again go back in our time machine, which I keep going back to because it's interesting now that we see everything looks like in hindsight. Yes, of course, we have to embrace this. But going back, did you see companies incorporating data and analytics in storytelling? Could you have seen at that point that there is something coming? Like, to what extent did these companies, specifically for PR, specifically for communications, leverage analytics, leverage data? Because I read somewhere that for innovation, follow your gut, but for revelations, look at data, right? It's easy to say that now, but I'm just curious, how much of that is the reason why these companies have been successful?
Oh, absolutely. And I think like that's a really great question because I've spent most of my career actually leveraging data and insights, like and turn them into like something new and like something creative, a PR moment, for platforms. And I think like you're right, like just in terms of like seeking data for revelations, but the thing with data is that like it can only give you so much. So it is still important for you to begin with a hypothesis or an initial concept, like what do you want to look for? What exactly are you looking for? And how do you envision that story come to life? What is the headline that you want to arrive at? Like if you do find data that supports that. So it's important to have that like strong drive and direction to begin with, because like if you don't have that, then the data won't really tell you much, because it's all going to be, you're all just going to be like running through data all day, and you don't really have an idea of how you're going to be packaging that into a meaningful story.
So like garbage in, garbage out. You need to make sense out of it.
100%. And that starts with like having a point of view on where you want to take the story. And like some of the most successful stories and campaigns that I've had the privilege of working on actually like incorporates insights from the platform. So whether it's like, you know, I remember like really fun stories that we did at Spotify around like what music do people listen to, what genres do they listen to, like when they're stuck in traffic jams, or you know, like the phenomenon that Netflix has seen among people when, like your significant other actually travels, and like you basically can't wait to binge the movie, and like you can't wait to binge the series, and like you just go ahead and binge it, and that's Netflix cheating. And what are like some of the most interesting things that like get lost in Ubers and found at Ubers? So some of the most successful like stories and like most interesting stories that I worked on have actually I would say like they're a confluence of data and insights from the platform, but then there's also like a great degree of like creativity and imagination.
I love that you packaged it like that, because that was my understanding, but you reiterated it, that the cultural moments that PR creates, they're not in the void. It's not a lone company spokesperson saying this is it, but
No.
it's something that you're riding on a feeling or a cultural episode or a phenomena that the PR person or the community can actually kind of, drive around. Um, the next thing that I wanted to ask was a bit of a pivot, but even though I'm very interested in just going into a rabbit hole for PR, like I love this topic. It's more about, you talk about resilience and like having resilience in a career. What does resilience mean to you? What are some of the habits or like techniques, or is it a growth mindset? Like what does resilience mean to you? How does this translate today in a very uncertain time when things are changing very rapidly, and it scares a lot of people? So I thought that's something that we should definitely touch upon.
Yeah, absolutely. Like we live in a very, very interesting time, like where there's like a lot of uncertainties. And I would say like there's a lot of industries that are increasingly becoming volatile. What I mean by resilience, and like this is like something that I take away from, like just not just like being in PR for like almost 20 years of my career, but also just like living in like calling 4 different countries home, is resilience for me is growing through what you go through.
Okay.
Like and what you go through sometimes, like everything that you go, there are things that you go through that you don't want to go through. There are things that like you'd rather escape, or like like there are things that you'd rather not do. It's like a job that you don't want to do. Like, okay, like I love the storytelling part of it, but I don't want the budget management part of it. But like you have to actually go through these things, and you will always take something from it, however mundane, however painful, however challenging something is.
Yeah.
Trust in the process, and you will learn something from it.
Yeah.
And for me, that is like what the essence of resilience is that ability and that resolve and that willpower to grow through
I love
everything
that.
you go through.
I love that. Feeling very inspired and ready to go out there and like just do something. More on like more tactical approach, right? Like what are the tools that have really helped you? Is it like networking? Is it LinkedIn? Like going a bit granular. I think a lot of our audience sometimes want like, I want to do these 10 things that I've not tried out. I mean, you don't have to say 10 things. Like, what are the things that, that have worked for you? And maybe you've not done them, but maybe they're relevant for now.
Yeah, I think like this is the thing too, is that I guess like I will say this like disclaimer because I want to make sure that like, okay, like I advise this like based on my own experience, but I would say that like it's important to really know what works for you. Because some people, they might not, for example, like there's a lot of advice being like, create content on LinkedIn. Everyone is now a thought leader on LinkedIn, but some people are not comfortable with doing that.
Yeah.
Some people would rather, I know some people that would just like rather do something else like behind the scenes, be part of something bigger, but like they still do the work, but like it's not putting themselves out there.
Yeah.
So this is like coming in from like a perspective of someone who has been writing since she was 10 years old, like absolutely like loves connecting with people, absolutely loves sharing her thoughts in a space. And I think for me, LinkedIn has been extremely helpful for me in my career. Not just like, okay, like, being visible, like I've actually like been fortunate to have landed some of my most rewarding jobs via LinkedIn, and people just like approach me out of the blue and come to me with like that idea, and I just like go for it. But I think it has been super helpful for me to connect with people and also share my thoughts. So that's one. I think like what's also like really worked for me was not like just networking per se, but like actually like maintaining relationships, like and focusing on the quality of relationships that I have with people. Some of the most I would say rewarding opportunities as well that like I've ever had actually came from my friends, and I've been very very grateful for their support and their really just like sponsorship, right?
Yeah.
Advocacy for me.
Yeah.
And like I think especially like in the world right now, like I've seen a lot of relationships become a lot more transactional,
Mm.
and that's the thing. It's like you don't just go to a person because you need something from them, or
Mm.
like but you want to get to know them as
Mm.
people. I think
Mm.
like that's important to not lose sight of the
Mm.
fact that like they are people,
Mm.
and that like they have their own dreams and aspirations and challenges.
Mm.
And I think like having that perspective then kind of like helps you in a way,
Mm.
like in terms of how you approach them, and also know that like they are there. It's not just like a one-off thing.
Mm.
Like there's a potential to build a relationship with a person, and like even though they're not necessarily, I don't know, they might not be of help to you right now, but you can learn something from them along the way. So always like be open-minded about relationships, and like not be too focused on the short-term rewards of networking.
I love that. I want to unpack that a bit more because I feel like a lot of us have been told that it's networking and then building real relationships and that there's a difference.
Hmm.
But what does, I mean, I think you touched upon it a bit that, a real relationship is more authentic, but what is it not? Where I'm coming from is personally, I believe if, you cannot connect with someone on a personal level, or if it feels forced, that's, you're trying the more networking route and not actually building a relationship. But that's just a personal theory of mine. Like, how would you, I don't think it's as clear. Could you demystify that a bit? Like, what is an authentic relationship as opposed to transactional networking?
I think that like one of the mistakes that I've seen people do a lot, and I think like I'm speaking from my own experience, like on LinkedIn, is that people immediately, like reach out to you either for to sell something,
Mm.
like they add you to sell something, or ask for a job referral. And I think like that's really like not going to be a good way to go about it,
Mm.
because you basically like
They don't know you.
you didn't really like I would say like even make that connection that like you understood them as a person.
Yeah.
And I think like a better way to go about it is really trying to find common ground or establish common ground with them.
Mm.
And I don't know, like just like look at their, like look at their profile, like what have they been interested in, like what are they writing about,
Mm.
and provide a point of view on that,
Mm. Mm.
and see where that relationship goes versus like shooting your shot in like your first message where I think the I think the odds of like making, I would say like the odds of actually like you getting a response would be lower than
Mm.
if you actually try to have a conversation
Yeah.
based on a shared interest or like a shared passion point.
I love that. You mentioned that some of the comments that you had you had like a mind shift. Um, can you give an example of such a mind shift, or maybe not through your LinkedIn comments, maybe like a book, a podcast, a mentor? How has Belle's perspectives changed? Like, can you walk us through Belle era 1, 2, 3? Are they? Can we make those segmentations?
I think, oh my goodness, like I think there's a theory that I came across, which I think is like super true. Like, it's a theory that like that says that people change every 5 years, and I think like every 5 years, like I continue to evolve. Like I think I'm still like largely the same person inside of me, like as a 17-year-old. But then I've learned a lot of like new lessons along the
Mm.
way. I think like one of the things that I've really learned and I continue to learn from actually along the way is to like I always have been interested in nurturing like my leadership skills. And I think that like there's a fundamental shift that happens like when you go from individual contributor to like a manager of a small team to a manager of a bigger team to a director or manager of a bigger team. And I think there's like a big mindset shift that like needs to happen when you are an A player on your own versus now like you empower A players to be, rather you empower your team to be A players themselves. And I have to be honest that like in my early years, like when I was younger, I wasn't very sure of like how I would establish that. I wasn't a very good manager at the time because like I didn't know how to translate all my expertise, all my all the skills that I've learned and I knew how to deliver myself into making sure that my team was equipped with that. But like over time, like mistakes had to be made, like you learn from people as well. I think that like I've slowly learned to kind of like really unpack that and make sure that like you basically empower your team to do something that's also like based on their key strengths because not everyone is good at everything. So I would say like that evolution of me as a leader, like I've seen that like happen, like really, like I've seen that happen and it's still happening right now. I'm still learning. And one of the books that I've read on leadership that like really changed my perspective was this book from Julie Zhao. She was like one of the first few product managers at Facebook. And her book is titled The Making of a Manager. And she talks exactly about this whole journey of amazing individual contributor to now being tasked to lead and actually nurture like a team of individuals. And like most of the time that like people are not ready to make that transition. And there has to be like a mindset shift in order for you to be able to now like you're not just like doing, but you're actually like delegating and empowering your team.
Wow, I love that. Thank you for sharing that because that's super personal in a way, right? So, two follow-up questions for that. One is how much does a leader how does that mind shift happen? Is that outcome based? Is it like I'm not getting the right results, the right outcomes? Uh, or is it just something that comes out of self-awareness and reflection? That's question one. Question two is if you're with a mentor who might be struggling with delegating or kind of framing things and maybe at the transitional phase of learning how to like deal with this, how as a mentee can you aid the process? Like what questions can you ask or do you have conversations? So it's two-sided. You can answer whichever one you want.
I think I'll take the first question first. Like, let's
Yeah.
backtrack to that.
Yeah.
I think that like a lot of self-awareness and reflection comes from, like comes like into making sure that like you don't make the same mistakes
Okay.
that you've made in the past. And I think like that actually like for me like like there were several realizations that I had to make. But then you don't again you don't you have to you have to grow through what you go through.
Okay.
And if you didn't have those experiences, you wouldn't even have a reason to reflect on those
Yeah,
experiences.
yeah.
And so like it's important to take something away from whether it's a like it's a painful experience, it's a challenging experience, like it's important to take something away from that. Otherwise you're not going to grow. And I think like going back to your point of like around mentors and mentees, like how they could go about this, it's like for me, I always, whether I'm in a mentor position or I'm in a mentee position, like I always try to take something from the person that I'm speaking with. And I think like that's like really a dialogue. And that also then requires a dialogue of transparency to some degree, because if transparency and vulnerability, I would say, because you have to be honest, like and actually like also like lay it out there to the person that you're speaking with, and be as authentic as much as possible so that they can really like learn from you directly and not necessarily learn something that you're just saying because you think it will sound good.
Sound good, yeah. Wow, I love that. I don't want to keep continuing that point. I want to make a shift to, I think we're short on time now. So just to wrap this up, thank you for making the time today to speak with us. But I just wanted to leave the viewers with a favorite book or a podcast, something that maybe helped you or shaped your perspectives. Could you share something that you read recently?
Oh my goodness, like I've been, I love reading. I could like stay like just, locked up in a room all day just reading. But I think like apart from the making of a manager, which was like a book that I shared with you earlier, one of the books that really stayed with me is this book called Rare Breed. It is not your typical business book. It's
Okay.
actually a guide for the defiant, the dangerous, the different, basically the rare breed.
Okay.
It's actually like written by like these two brand builders and marketers, and they basically like provide a series of lessons that have practical applications, not just in business, but actually like in your life. And I think like there's actually a couple of lessons that I remember from just like reading that book. I think like the first one was around, and it was so funny because this one was, there is a metaphor, and it says massage the octopus,
Okay.
and when you massage the octopus, like apparently like what that means is to actually like really commit, to actually like really devote yourself to the lifelong mass pursuit of mastery in something. So massaging the octopus is like when you massage the octopus, like sometimes like it can go back to its old form, but like be patient at it and like working through that,
Okay.
the different shifts of the octopus. I think like that's like it's a really like a really interesting metaphor for like what life throws at you. And I think like the other advice was like being loyal to the nightmare. And sometimes like life can be a waking nightmare for people. And there's a lot of things that you don't want to go through.
Mm.
But once you commit yourself to a path,
Mm.
it's like go all in that journey.
Mm.
Don't hold back, because at the end of the day, you will be rewarded in some way if you're loyal to the nightmare.
Oh, wow. I love that. I'm super intrigued. I'm definitely going to get this book. I'm very inspired. But I'm also super inspired by the conversation that we had today. And I'm pretty sure all our viewers going to appreciate that as well. Thank you for joining us today, Belle.
Oh, well, thank you so much. Congrats. Like, I just really love our conversations. And thank you so much to the Beyond Brands team for having me. Really appreciate this opportunity.
Thank you. And be tuned in for our next one also. Bye.